So, okay, I am going to introduce you Professor Sara de Freitas, and I can't give justice to you because your bio is amazing, so I invite everybody from the audience to either check out the conference website or in the conference app, her bio, where you will be able to find links to her work, her publications and books. But for the moment, I just would like to say that she's a Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Cumbria, and she is very passionate about a pedagogy-driven approach to leadership, and she is focusing on research in game-based learning, for example, and how accelerated learning can contribute to better quality learning and greater retention and flexibility. It plugs in very nicely to Jeff's presentation. So without further ado, Sarah, it's a pleasure to have you, and the stage is yours. Thank you.
Ildiko. Ildiko, can you come back and maybe help me a little bit? So I wanted to be a little bit sort of, well, you know, as controversial as I could be to try and sort of liven up the debate around this area. I'm going to talk today about games in education. And I wanted to sort of pose a question to the audience, actually, and this is where, Ildiko, if you can capture that in some way, it'd be good. And I wanted to sort of start with saying, is it unethical to not use games in education? So I wanted to pose that question out to the audience, just to give you a second to think about it. So if you could hold your hands up if you think, yes, it is unethical to not use games in education, and if you could take a rough count of that. Let's see. I just want to see, I'll ask the question at the end just to see whether anyone's moved their position.
Roughly 15 or so.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. This will be like the power of persuasion over the research that we've done. So I really wanted to talk today a little bit about a sort of retrospective, really, because I've been in the field for about 20 years, and I remember 20 years ago and, you know, thinking about future of learning, thinking about games, and I just wonder, we have come quite far, actually, when we think about it over those last 20 years, but I wanted to sort of capture some of the research element around that. I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the assumptions around game-based learning and its use, and talk a little bit about rescoping, as something I've been thinking about for probably about 10 years, is how we could rescope the field of education science as a whole. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well, and then try to sort of, in some way, bust those assumptions, and then conclude as well. So, I think probably quite a few of you already know me, but I'm an academic, basically, and a senior executive with 20 years of experience in higher education. But I really wanted to sort of pick up on that area around conscious and unconscious bias, because throughout my career, I've experienced a little bit of this along the way, let's say. And I think we all have this within us. But I also think it's really imperative to review and re-review the research and to look at the findings and what they are telling us. I think we need to be evidence-based and we need to be research-based. And it's easy to sort of say that. But if we're not going to do that, we're not going to be able to actually really move on, because we have to bring our colleagues with us, of course. And I think the bias against games is really a significant bias. The overriding assumptions that are there and the traditional education sort of infrastructure and the models that we have continue to guide research in this new field as well. And I think that these restrictions have actually slowed down and in some cases actually prevented implementation of game-based approaches and, you know, innovative approaches in a more general sense as well. I think also the isolationist approaches in the US that we've seen from G.W. Bush and obviously continuing to Trump has created a bit of a wedge between the US research in my field and European research. And you see it in the papers. So you'll see only the American references, or you'll see only European references. And, you know, obviously that's not something that, you know, really is something that we want to see. And I think it's really isolating some of our really talented researchers and individuals around the world. So I think really, for me, it's really about how do we break those barriers down, how do we start to share again and try and move forward in that way. I think also that there's a whole challenge around proving the effectiveness of games, and that's something that, you know, me and my my research team and other researchers around the world have tried to undertake much more rigorous study to try and actually show the evidence that game-based approaches are effective. And of course, this work has been growing over the last 10 to 15 years, and we've seen the same thing in e-learning, I think, broadly. And I think the arguments have been made now in e-learning. And of course, with e-learning, we saw no significant difference between traditional and e-learning approaches. So I think today that the evidence base is strong enough that actually it's very difficult to refute the efficacy of games as effective learning tools. And I think today it's clear that the shape of education is clearly in flux and change, and that games provide not just sort of immersive environments for us to look at and to develop and build, but also they provide a really good metaphor for what new learning, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, what new learning is and how we can actually engage our students more. So I'm not very good on this. Okay, so 5 assumptions then that I think have really guided research in educational research and probably more broadly across e-learning research as well. The first one is that games are addictive. Now, for me, this is sort of funny because, we just don't have the budgets in higher education at the moment to make really addictive games, unfortunately. So I think that argument for me it sort of falls a bit flat, but because people have got that preconception, they take that through, and obviously that's been really a problem. The other assumption, second assumption, is really that games are for children and not for adults. We know that children learn really well through games and that they socialize through gameplay as well, but adults also play games. And there's no evidence really that adults learn in substantially different ways to children, although there may be some differences there. Pedagogy is the third one. Pedagogy has nothing to do with games and play, and I think that this can be quite easily kicked away in terms of the work that Piaget and other theorists have done, where they've shown that all learning is play in some cases, and playful learning has become quite a dominant part of the research area. I think the fourth assumption then is really that games are not effective for learning, and for me, this has been probably the more difficult assumption to refute. And I think it's clear that we're still in a process of flux around this, and we're looking at the research. But I don't think it can be assumed that it is not effective, and I'll show some of the research around that now. And then the last assumption is that games are too expensive to produce for education. Now, on the one side of that, costs have been coming down dramatically over the last 20 years. We've got game maker software, we've got Unity development platforms, gamification, mini games. It's all much easier now to produce high-quality games. So for me, and I think it is quite a hostile environment out there, what did we learn and how did we change our teaching as a result of that? So I really wanted to look at what the evidence was that game-based and gameplay and game-based learning is supportive of learning and teaching. So our research has really focused on that line, our initial research. And what we found was that educational games were more effective than educational methods of learning in the cases that we looked at. So one of the studies that we did was really around, and this is quite a long time ago now, it's probably about 10 years ago. This game was produced by Blitz Games, which was a company in the UK, and this was an emergency response game called Triage Trainer, and the idea was a bomb had exploded in a busy urban area, you're the medic arriving, and you have to sort through the casualties in order of priority. And you need to evaluate the game. We wanted to look at 3 elements. One was to check the vital signs, the other one was tagging, and the other one was the time that it took to do that. So I'll just sort of skip on because there's quite a bit to get through. So we published our findings in the Journal of Resuscitation. And some of you might know it. I think it's quite a significant paper in the field. Basically, we undertook, it was led by University of Birmingham. We undertook trials with 91 UK NHS doctors, nurses and paramedics. And we had 2 conditions, the game and the non-game condition. So what we found then was that in the non-game condition, so that was basically using actors as casualties and a card sort system. The game was the game that you saw. And our findings were quite interesting, and we weren't expecting these findings at all, but the findings were that in the tagging, so that was the order in which you were tagging the different casualties, significantly higher accuracy than the non-game condition. In the step accuracy, that was the order that you were checking the vital signs. So again, significantly more accurate than the non-game condition. And the time taken was no significant difference, but if there had been time, there would have been quite a significant difference there as well. So obviously that was quite interesting, because in the e-learning studies that we looked at, there was no significant difference generally with between traditional and e-learning approaches. So we already knew that something was kind of interesting about this, but trying to get that out there was obviously going to be quite a challenge, as we didn't know that at the time, but we published in 2010, but there hasn't been a massive move from then. But we wanted to sort of ask, why were games effective? And I think that was really the next line that we really went down. And that was really, from our point of view, it was really about engagement. And engagement really has become a really key element in higher education. And we believed also that there was an improved transfer of learning when you were using in a more immersive environment. So the possible reasons for that were that, you had the opportunity to rehearse, to practice skills and so on, to practice them in a realistic and a more engaging environment, but really importantly, personalized feedback and the role of feedback in terms of reinforcement of learning and of improving learning through that repeated play. So what we really wanted to do then was to think about the pedagogic issue, which was what role does engagement play in learning, and will enhanced student engagement support greater student success? What is engagement and how can it be measured? And the work that I've done in the period since then has really looked at that, and quite a few of the papers that will be in publication. Obviously there's always that lag with publications, but you'll start to see that work coming through, which is really looking at how do we create greater student engagement. And we actually found that with greater engagement you had a positive link with self-efficacy improvements and better student outcomes. So that work has been quite interesting, and I think without that game-based approach, maybe we would have been asking different questions and in a different way. So I think that journey has been quite interesting. So going back to this idea about rescoping, so what does this all mean, and how does it fit into where we are now? We had a really interesting plenary session earlier, and I think what I really want to highlight in this slide is really around the 4 strands that are coming together to bring us to where we are now and to push us forward. And I think they merit a rescoping, and this is something that I'll try and address in my next book whenever I get a bit of time to write that one. But really what we've seen then is the contribution, in my field at least, from education science has really been to look at play, and we talked about play, and we talked a little bit earlier about Jean Twenge's fantastic work, longitudinal studies, where she's shown how important play is, and she's examined those play patterns and the links between play and learning and resilience and well-being. It has really, I think, been ironed out in that work. I think the second strand is really around game studies, or game science is what we're tending to call it now. And that's really been around what is motivation? How do we motivate students? And I think that Jeff really made that point quite subtly in his work earlier. And also what we've been trying to do is really to look at these randomized controls and pragmatic randomized control trial to look and see whether games are more effective than traditional learning. We've found that as I said earlier, that they are. And then finally, really that introduction of qualitative and quantitative research, for example, Pam Cato's work around that, the strength of that, I think that's actually really started to innovate and actually has positive impact on the research in other areas as well. The contribution from neuroscience, and I'm going to now talk a little bit about neuroscience in the next sort of section of the talk. We've seen the work from Simone Kuhn, who's really shown that greater brain volume and plasticity with gameplay, and also, of course, the really excellent work of Daphne Bavelier, who's talked about transferability of skills, such as hand-eye coordination and visual acuity. And then the 4th strand, which I'm quite excited about myself because my PhD was in the area of information science, is the contribution from information science. And what we're seeing there, and we talked about this, Ben talked about this very eloquently earlier, what we're seeing is that the capability to actually model human behavior within data-driven environments is a really exciting way of understanding those interactions and of getting down to another level of granularity around personalized learning and understanding that. And analytics is really the big driver for that. So I think those four strands together, and there's probably more, but these are the ones that really have sort of come through the work that I've done. I think that merits a rework and a redrawing of that boundary. So going to sort of the area around learning then, and I think it's really important to get back to pedagogy and to start to learn about that, is this shift that we've seen, and I think this graph sort of shows that transition from traditional to new learning as I've been talking about it. John Dewey uses this phrase, it's not a new phrase at all, but I think that you could sort of get an idea of where we are sort of now. And that step between traditional to new has actually been quite rapid over the last 10 years. But I think more interestingly for this conference perhaps is that look into that future learning, the next step. And for me that's really about, we've talked about AI-driven, scaffolded learning, seamless lifelong learning. I think the disappearance of assessment and the disappearance of assessment in terms of new sorts of forms of assessment, so for example in a game, leveling up and so on. And then the unique learning patterns, adaptive learning, and I think a more effective hidden curriculum. And then this idea around blended work and learning is important too. So I guess in terms of my own research, the link between physiological and cognitive functioning is critical for really understanding learning. And I think to be in a more immersive environment, to be able to interact in that way, is really reinforcing that circle of learning. So that's that metacognition learning through your different senses and then processing that and moving that forward. And we've seen in studies that look at animals and how they play, how there is a sensitive period where learning is actually accelerated. And I think this is an exciting thing that we've also seen in, of course, human children, human babies and young children. You see the similar kind of pattern of this accelerated learning in the sensitive period. And what we want to do with gameplay is to try and extend that sensitive period to elongate that and to try and support that further.
An increase in volume indicates that part of the brain has grown. Could this really be achieved by playing a video game?
We indeed found brain growth. We found increases in the right hippocampus over here, which is a brain region that is particularly involved in spatial navigation, in orienting in your world. Another brain region that increased in that experimental group was the prefrontal cortex on the right side. That's an area related to strategic planning. And the last region is called cerebellum, and that's particularly renowned to be involved in fine motor tuning in a way. I mean, really handling the joystick well.
Professor, an increase.
So that was Professor Simon Kuhn talking a little bit about brain plasticity. My own work, I've looked at the four-dimensional framework, and I think some of you might be aware of that work that I've done, and we've also developed a feedback model, which we haven't tested yet, but hopefully we will start to test, because what we're trying to do is trying to link, again, that human behavior, the understanding of how we learn, to the interactions within the environment. So I think that's a really big challenge for us still, but I think if we can start to crack that, we can really start to move forward. So here's just a sort of summary of some of the research, the gaps in the research and future research. I'm not going to read through it because I think you can all read there. And I want to really move then to the end part of the presentation, where I look again at those 5 assumptions we looked at the beginning. So for me, the idea that games are addictive is something where that's pointing to me to student engagement. We need to be able to, if we can make learning addictive, I don't see that as necessarily a bad thing. But obviously trying to move towards that place is, I think, should be a driver for research. And then also, we do need to do more research around why games are effective with children and adults. And I think there are some very interesting lines of research in that space too. And then I do think that educationalists have to explore effective learning in all contexts, and that is an ongoing process, and it's something that we're all doing. And our studies have shown that games are more effective than traditional learning, so I think that there's actually an ethical and a moral obligation for educators to start to look at that and how we can actually start to embed that more in our practice. And then finally, educating children and young adults is, I think, the most important social lever that we have in society. And for that reason alone, we need to look and find the level of investment we need to improve the quality of our educational games. And I think that that may involve collaboration, that may involve work across nations, but I do think it's a really important thing that we need to do. So if we don't start thinking about how to do that now, well, we're going to lose another 10 or 20 years. So I think it's really that, for me, there is quite a moral obligation to game-based learning. So I'm going to end, or sort of end, with asking the same question again, and Ildiko, you can take count. So how many people would now put their hand up when I say, is it unethical not to use games in education? I mean, there may be less people. But be proud with your arms high, just so we can count. How many?
25, 30.
Ooh.
From 15.
I think that's yeah. Well, I mean, this is a bit experimental, but you know, and it could have gone the other way. But I'm quite glad to see that argument maybe has been made and is clear. So I just wanted to also before I close, just to sort of point to some resources for teaching practitioners thinking about using games. Here are some games that I've used in my own experience, and then there's some more examples of games that are already out there, and some references to support what I've been saying. Here are the books that I've published, my most recent one there, Education. Of course, I'm going to plug the book, okay, sorry. But there's one there, obviously, Digital Games and Learning, which focuses on this area. And those are my contact details as well. So you've been a fantastic audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And as I mentioned earlier, you can also find links to her publications and books in her online bio in the app and on the conference website as well. Thank you very much for being in time. I think we have time for questions as well, if anybody has any. I have the microphone. Okay, we'll start there.
I can do it.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Yeah, I have a question about, well, gamification, obviously. There's the digital component to gamification, but there's not, I don't know personally that much about a non-digital component of gamification. And I was wondering if there's any information about the effectivity of gamification in a non-digital setting.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot of literature in that space. There's a guy called Gobet, who's a French theorist, who's done actually some very interesting work in that space. So I would point you to his work to follow up on that. Obviously, there are different sorts of pressure points in that research, but
because all
the
of
drive is similar, actually.
Because a lot of the assumptions are about the digital component of gamification, but not so much like games being addictive. That's, I think, is a stigma connected to the digital version of games, but not so much to the analog, the non-digital version of gamification. So I was wondering if there's any like distinctions between those two in any way. But yeah.
Yeah, I think the drive is similar, but I think you're right. I mean, I don't think it is such a stigma. I think the digital has sort of pushed us into a different space. And we've talked quite a bit about, you know, mobile technology and Jean Twenge's work and so on, and you know, the impact of mobile technology on children and so on. So I think that there are different pressure points in the debate between the digital and non-digital games.
Right.
But I think the general drive is it's around play and the effectiveness of play.
Right.
So there's a lot of similarities in the work.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for the presentation, first of all. My bachelor is in early childhood education, and it may sound funny, but it took years of research, well established, to convince people to use games and play in early childhood education the last year, which is actually funny, imagine in the adult world.
How long did it take?
It's still ongoing, like the south of Europe is still very much avoiding to let children play and use games, so they are more using other methods still. So that's why I moved to Scandinavia, just to go back and prove like play works for children. So now I'm working with adults, and I face much more bias when it comes to using games to train them. The problem with all levels of education and all levels of learning is actually how to prove, and I think that's why people nowadays avoid to use it, about assessing the benefits in a formal way. So, for example, you have PISA tests, you have that. How can you measure in a formal way and prove that, yeah, the students are learning not in a 1 + 1 way equals 2, but in so many different ways in a holistic way? And do you think there is like enough and adequate research proving or putting frameworks in a kind of more formal way of assessing the benefits or assessing the outcomes, the learning outcomes when it comes to learning through play?
I think it's a really important question. I think a lot of it is there already, but I think it goes back to that point about disconnects between the different research areas, and I think that that's been difficult. I think the other issue we face in our field is that there's not that many of us across the world. So when you've got that isolation issue going on in the US, that makes it harder because we've got some really good people in the US, got some really good people in the rest of the world. We need to work together though, because they're just to get that critical mass. So I think that the core research is there. Probably there's more to do. I mean, there's always going to be more research to do. I would say that I'm a researcher, but I do genuinely think that we're moving in the right direction. But I think there's almost that layer of guidelines and practical sort of support that probably we just need to invest a little bit more in, across the world. But I mean, why can't we don't have to all pay for this? Could we not, just work together and, through collaboration, I think we can push forward as well. But I think the assessment piece is a big piece for the whole of education, not just for game-based. But I think games open the door a little bit to some possible solutions for where we are with assessment at the moment.
If I may plug into that question, because you're in such a unique position to be so influential, would you have any recommendations to the audience if they would like to make a change in their institutions, where to start? Would they start at proofs of assessment, or what should they take home?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm quite interested in is even just some light touch gamification. If we could just put in badging, if we could put just light sort of leveling up, leaderboards, gamified elements. I mean, obviously narrative is something you want to bring in, but obviously that can be quite difficult and a bit more expensive to do. So I'd like to see a lot more quite light touch gamification across the piece. And Moodle has already quite a lot of capabilities within it to do badging and to do all kinds of things. And a lot of the learning management systems have a lot of functionality that can already be used. And I've obviously piloted that in some of the universities I worked in. And, we've built quite big game engines and so on at Curtin University. So there's so many different levels you can engage. But I think just making that first step to just starting and then really making sure that you're capturing the data and you're understanding what made that impact. And I think if we can show that, then we can start to bring the community together around that and move forward. So baby steps.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, yeah, and perseverance, I guess.
And keep going.
Yeah, thank you very much. Any further questions?
I'm glad I got a bit of chance to do a bit of interaction with the audience.
Well, it's actually more a remark than a question. But I think that in teaching, there might be a shift from teaching subjects to teaching competencies or letting learners achieve competences. And this might be a chance to switch more to games, because, I mean, just imagine a teacher teaching a subject, then it's not close to use a game for that because the game is not part of the subject. But if it's about competencies, it's more about training, interaction, and this might be an argument to use games. And in Germany, where I live in particular, there's even a political shift towards achieving competence rather than learning subjects. So the situation might be used for introducing games into education.
No, I think that's a fantastic observation, and I completely agree. I do think the pedagogy shift is just it's so much in favour of more immersive environments and interactive environments that it just seems like a very natural next step. But I've been saying that for probably more than 10 years, so it could take a bit longer. But I do think it is a conservative, very conservative sector we're in. There is a fear of change and there's a fear of innovation, and I think there've been some very poor technological transformational projects. So, we are working in an environment which is difficult, but I think if we keep with the pedagogy and we keep thinking around curriculum change in terms of the pedagogic changes, I think that we'll bring the educators on board, because I think the educators are just a bit, sort of suspicious of technologically driven initiatives. And I don't think and often they just don't stick. So I think having a more pedagogically driven approach, whether that's through the curriculum or whether that's through competencies and skills, or whether we sort of rework that notion of challenge-based learning, which is, I think, where probably the pressure point will favour games a lot. I feel quite positive actually, and quite excited about the future in that respect.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? That's there's one. I thought, yeah, thank you.
This is more about implementation of game-based education or gamification. One of the things that I guess I'm having trouble thinking in my mind, and maybe you might have an answer for this, is because our university and our system is still points-based to receive a grade, I was wondering, how have you been able to implement or think about assessments for gamification and using it in a point-based system, considering that a lot of games are used based on voluntariness or rewarding students based on what they know rather than what we want them to know, if that makes sense.
Sorry, what was the question?
So the question is, how have you been able to implement games or game-based learning or gamification in a possible point-based system where you get a letter grade for whatever you achieve and such? Because our university is in that model.
So do you mean sort of the traditional system and game-based, they're sort of not really that well aligned at the moment? I think, yeah, I think that's really a good point. And Simon Egelnolt Nielsen from Denmark, he wrote about this in his PhD quite well, I think, saying that the infrastructure of traditional education, it is difficult to see how games can really fit into that. But I do think there's more flexibility in the timetable now than there was before, and I think people are starting to think about the timetable a bit differently. So I do think that that's opening a little bit, but I think again it's quite a big piece like assessment. There's a lot of discussion and there's a lot of work we need to do to get to a point where we could start to open up people to think a little bit differently in terms of how they assess and in terms of how they support the development of game-based approaches. So I don't think it's really an answer probably, but I think I'm basically agreeing with you. I think we've still got a way to go before I think we bring those bits together. But I think you can start to see now that there is a bit more of a convergence.
Okay.
And I think that's exciting. Sorry.
Have you been able to see any sort of way of integrating it, or have there been ways just so that you can assign some sort of points or some sort of way of acknowledging that they did the game itself?
Yeah, I mean, the work that I've done with Moodle, for example, is quite a good example, I think, because you can sort of start to see how we're using the mechanisms that are already there digitally to start to layer in gamification, quite subtly and quite light touch. And I think that's probably quite a good first step. But I think ultimately, I mean, for me, the vision that I have for education really is something between a learning management system and a game engine or a game system. There's going to be a convergence point between those, and I think when we reach that point, that's going to be the optimal point for gamification, because I think we'll be able to then we'll have the infrastructure and we'll have the sort of the political will, and things will sort of align at that time. Now that could take another 10 years, unfortunately, but I'm hoping it'll take closer to 5 than 10, and you can sort of start to see a lot of the LMSs are already building in this sort of capability. So I think that it is really a case of just keep trying to move on forward, and even smaller steps, I think we can start to move towards this greater convergence. But I'm working quite closely with Martin from Moodle and others just to sort of try to see, are there ways that we can actually use existing infrastructure rather than having to build new infrastructure. But I mean, I'd like to see a really very well-resourced project in this space that really does just say, look, okay, we're going to create a game engine type approach, something similar to what we've done at Curtin University with Challenge App, but just something where there's quite a big ambition behind it, and something that could maybe look initially at school education, but then could be used in terms of higher education as well.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm afraid we kind of ran out of time. Do you have a short question? Okay.
I'm just wondering whether it's not also a problem of terminology. I know it's now known as gamification, but we know that particularly in higher education, they are getting all nervous if we are using even terms like classroom. Yeah, so I think if we perhaps find a better name for it, because as soon as I use surveys or polls or other things to describe these things, then people are starting to use them. So I don't know whether that could be a good point.
No, I think that's absolutely spot on. But I've racked my brain for another word for game, and to be honest with you, I've been really unsuccessful so far. But send your answers in on a postcard, because I'd really like to know. But I mean, when you say simulation, a simulation is actually quite different from a game, and we've seen studies like Tricia Matoni's study where she's shown actually that when you actually put the two together, games are more effective than simulations. So I think there has to be a distinction still. But I think you're absolutely right. If you're writing in your application, sometimes just putting game on it is just going to set the hairs running. And I think that we need to get to a different place. But I do think there's going to be a generational shift, Because I think once the Gen Xers finally get into senior management, I think things are going to start to shift, because of course we've grown up with games, and it just makes sense to us. It's sort of weird that it's not all gamified already. But I think as you start to then move into the millennial generation and the Gen Zs, I just think it's a matter of time, really. But I do think terminology is important, and of course we're academics, so we're very much interested in how things are defined. So it's going to be interesting to see whether we can find other words, whether we can actually sort of model things in a different way. But at the moment, it's sort of hard to see that happening.
Well, thank you very much for your engagement. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation and the answers. And I wish everybody a good lunch and see you around.
Thanks very much.